Okay, can you hear me, everyone? So, how many of you are using ng controller when you're writing a new code now? One. Don't be ashamed. That's all. One over there, one brave guy over there. Okay. So basically, I'm here to tell you to stop doing this if you are doing this. I'm here to tell you to stop using ng controller, stop using ng include, stop using directives. I mean, directives, there is one exception. If you use DOM manipulations, you are allowed to use directives, but other than that, don't use directives anymore. So why not using ng controller? So the first thing is scope inheritance. Scope inheritance is really nice. It was one of the most popular stuff in Angular 1. You can throw stuff on it, and it is available everywhere. But it really make it hard for you to track your application state. You don't know who put data on the scope and who reads it and where, and it became something that we called later scope soup. The second thing that we saw is pure view organization. We have one HTML file with a lot of controllers, and this is something that we don't want in our code. And the last part will be better preparations for Angular 2, because Angular 2, as you probably heard, will not have ng controller anymore. So what will we want to use instead? The first thing is, instead of ng controller, we will want to use a component. Each controller can be changed with a component. The second thing that I want you to change is when you use ng include, you can change to using a component, and instead of the template, you'll use the exact same template inside your component. So this is a conceptual change, but you should start using it. The other part is as I said before, the directives. We can start, thanks to Shachar, using it with Wix Angular. As of today, you don't need to wait for Angular 1.5. You can start using angular.module.component instead of directives. It is much simpler. It has best practices as defaults. You can see that we don't longer use link, for example. The syntax is a little bit different. I will show you more examples about it later. And the last part will be when using routing, you can route, for each route will be mapped to a component. This is a concept that is very strong in Angular 2, and we can start using it as of today. So each route will be mapped to a component, and we can also inject the resolve directly to the input of the component. So here you can see saved games. We can use the resolve function, the resolve data, directly in the input as the input for this component. So why using Angular 1.5, or with the help of Wix Angular, why using Angular component? So the first thing, it is configured as default to be best practices, to have best practices. It is simpler syntax. We don't need a lot of stuff, and Angular component removed it. It is optimized for component architecture and for Angular 2 migration. So let's talk a little bit about component architecture. First, what is a component? A component is a piece of UI that we can compose and reuse everywhere in our application. And what do we want from our component? So the first thing, we want it to have a clear public API. We want to know exactly what are the inputs and outputs for this component. The second thing, we want it to be mutable. We don't want it to change data that it doesn't own. If it gets an input, we don't want it to change it. And the third part is, we don't want it to have side effects or holding external references. This is a basic concept of functional programming, sorry. And I wanted to show you a small example about holding external reference. Can you see this? So here, for example, we can see something that a lot of people do. They use a reference, as you can see here, we call data service and use a reference, hold a reference for items from the service. And then we must do the trick in the service itself. I'm sure most of you saw, I saw it in a lot of projects here in Wix. We have to do the Angular copy stuff. Otherwise, it won't be updated. We have to initialize it with empty array, and we have to do the Angular copy stuff. Otherwise, it won't know about the changes, and it won't change the data. Same for clear here, for example. This example is, if I did not explain, it's a list of items and a button of clear. It's something really simple. And in order to solve this, we have several solutions. The simpler solution will be using data service directly in the template. As you can see here, we can use items, for example, here, data service.items in the template. This will solve the problem. We no longer need the copy stuff here or initializing the array. We can also use, instead of data service.items, we can use a helper function, but we shouldn't hold reference to the service. This is the basic part that we shouldn't do. Yeah, to external data that belongs to the service, right? Okay. Another architecture important thing is using unidirectional data flow. In Angular 1, we're used to two-way data binding. Here, when our components are immutable, they're getting their data from the main application component or from the parent component. And this is something that works exactly like this in Angular 2. We want to adapt it and use it in our Angular 1 applications. So data will flow downstairs via properties or inputs for the component. And when something is changed inside the component, it will not change this data. It will trigger an event upstairs. We'll see an example in a minute. And this way, the component is immutable, and this is unidirectional data flow. We can control our data inside our application much better in this way. So let's see a small example. We have here a controller with a list of items and a delete button. And let's start with, and this is its controller. The controller is initialized with a list of items and a delete function. Usually I'll use a service here. Here it's hard-coded. And let's make it a component. Let's start by changing from bottom up. Take the list of items and make it an item list component. As you can see, the items is the inputs here, which it gets from its parents. Sorry. And here's the component itself. We have input of items and the delete function. But something is wrong with this implementation. Can someone see what's wrong here? The delete, yeah. Actually, the items is the input of the component. So we shouldn't change it. It should be immutable. Here we got it as an input, but we are changing it. We're doing splice and deleting things from the array. So the solution will be, this is the problem. The solution will be adding an event, an onDelete event, and when the user will press this button, the button will trigger an event upstairs to the parent, and the parent will decide what to do with it. He can delete, he can move it forward, depends on if it owns it or not. So here we are registering our onDelete event from the parent, from the controller. And as I said before, we don't want controllers anymore. So, before, this is the component itself. Now we have, as we said before, we have a logic part, which is the controller. We have an input interface part, which is the bindings. And we have a view part, which is the HTML, the view, the template. Yeah, I don't need controller as anymore because I have the controller syntax. This is leftovers from the directive that was here before, right? So here I can use controller. I can delete the controller as it is. It is no longer needed anymore, right? Thanks. So what I'll do now in order to get rid of the controller, the ng controller, I'll change it to a component, to be a component. So instead of main controller, I'll have a main component, which you will have the same template. And as you can see, as Shachar said, we have $controller, $CTRL, which is the convention for component in Angular 1.5. And this will replace our controller. The shim is not doing it yet. Okay, thanks. So that's it. It was a really small example, but I wanted to demonstrate that you don't need to use ng controller anymore. Start using components instead. Start mapping your routes to components and stop using directives. Use components instead. Yes. Okay. Yeah, so this is a good question. The question was what will we do here when we'll have a lot of components in the way? So here starts, we have several solutions. This is actually similar to what React has in their own implementation, and same problems are there. And one solution is use smart and dump components. When there is a smart component that is doing all the logic, it's taking the data from the service. It's like a closed unit, and it will talk to dump components, which will only interact with the DOM. This will shallow the tree a little bit. And other solutions are stuff like Redux and Flux, right? So you can use architecture that will help solving. You don't have to use Flux or Redux, but this is a solution that will be much easier in Angular 2.0 because it's a solution that came from the React world, which uses exactly the same architecture. So it will be easier, I guess, in Angular 2.0. Sure. Same question. Sorry? What will we do when we'll have a lot of components in the way? So the tree will not be small, it will be a large tree which will have to pass events from side to side, for example. So we can have a tree with a lot of items and we want to pass an event to the other side of the tree, so we'll have to do a lot of passing of events. Yeah, so this is the smart and the dumb component, because the smart component will take the data itself from the service and do the logic and pass it to a dump component, which will only interact with the DOM. So you can use smart and dumb component. It will help here. Yeah. This is something that is React doesn't have it. They don't have dependency injections, so better solution. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah. Okay. No. It will not be available, I think, on Angular 2. So it's available on Angular 2? Okay. The question was, what about when we have require, for example, in directives, if we have it in components? So actually now we don't have it, but we'll have it later on Angular 1.5. So now with require, you should use directive for now. Okay. So thank you very much.
One. Hello. נראה מספיק מטומטם? 1, 2, 3. בנזונה. טוב הלך. שומעים? אוקיי. Can we start or do you need some break? Can we start? יניב? Okay. So after Yaniv explained the concept of components, we are going to look into a real life scenario where we are taking a page, and instead of thinking of it in the old way of creating controller and views, we will split it into components. And then we will also present how we can test it using the small test kit that we created in Wix Angular, which is highly recommended. So if we are looking into this page from Wix Booking, you can see. חשבתי שאין כמה רמקול? סבבה. סבבה, סליחה. So I'll speak up. So, can you see? So if you are looking into this page, you see that it's a very complex page. It includes a lot of elements. Some of them are quite simple and trivial, such as a name and description. But we also have a component that knows to read the information from the media gallery. And we have something that allows you to pick the location. So it has a selection between my place and other. And if you're selecting other, it will allow you to select the text. We have the duration, which is in minutes, but it's getting split into hours and minutes behind the scenes. So instead of creating one huge view and one huge controller to control all of it, we thought about doing it in a form of components. So for that, going into the page again, you can see that we can define one component for the photo picker, another component for the location picker, another component for the duration picker, and another component, actually two components for the time picker. It will be a time picker component which will be used twice. So we are going to stick into the duration picker. We are going to present how are we going to convert it into to test it using view unit testing, and then to convert it to use the driver that we created in Wix Angular. So the agenda is to understand the use case that we just presented, to see some code, how we created view unit to test it, then to present some of the problems with doing plain view unit, that it's not really reusable and things like that, and then to present the Wix-based driver that we created in Wix Angular, while converting the code that we will present for the normal view unit into using the driver, which will be done in a live demo. Then I'm also going to present how can I take the view unit that I created for this duration picker driver and use it when I'm testing the main component, because it is using it. And one of the key features that we created in this driver is the ability to have hierarchy. So you can have a parent driver, which is using some child drivers, and they know to initialize each other. And last but not least, we will also explain some key limitations with view unit and our driver. So the, the, the target of this exercise and the driver itself is to try to move as much logic as possible from protractor, which is heavy, flaky, and all these things, into view unit, and maintain them easily, getting the feedback. But we cannot just yet remove protractor completely, so we are going to state a few scenarios in which we still need to use them, to use it. Okay, so we discussed the duration picker that we are going to deep dive into. The requirements about it is that it will allow me to pick time as a form of hours and minutes. The default hour and minutes will be set to 0 if not provided, if it's a new form, not coming from a previous service. The information to the model has to be sent in a form of a single int. So when the user type in something, it has to get converted. And when the information is coming from the server, it has to get split to hours and minutes. And the validations about it is that it cannot be negative, and at least one of them has to be larger than 0. So either the hours or minutes has to be at least 1. If we are converting it to a testing requirement, then it should split duration into hours and minutes. It should set the hours and minutes to 0 when duration is not defined. It should update the duration in the model, and should validate that at least one of the inputs should be 1 and above, and the other can be 0 and above. If we look into the code, I'll probably have to enlarge it. Let me know when it's large enough. Is it good enough? Can you see? Okay. So as stated, we are creating a base page component, which is the entire page. It has its template. It has its template, which is using all the sub-components. All of them are separate components. If we look into the duration picker, you can see that it has all the logic to split the information from hours and minutes and what we just discussed. And its view is eventually a couple of inputs, one for the hours, one for the minutes, with the validations required. Even if I'm looking into the data model, the component is using something called duration item, so it only has a single element, which is the duration, and the big class, which is using everything, is just in order to consider it as an extension of component, because it has an image picker, so I'm considering it as a image container. So the component for image selection doesn't have to know that the actual model that it is using it is a class. It can also be anything else that can select an image. And the duration picker is an extension of duration item. The class is an extension of duration item. So if I have another component that wants to be able to select the duration, it will also extend the duration item. So the model for the component itself just has to know that it's working with something that has duration and nothing more than that. And the view unit, I suppose that at least some of you are familiar with view unit. It's eventually a form of testing your components from the view. Instead of getting into the controller itself and all the methods that you created in JavaScript, you are doing all the logic directly into the generated view. So here I'm working with the inputs themselves. I'm setting the values into the DOM itself, and I'm expecting that it will get reflected in the view itself. So I don't care how did I implement the method to split the values, but eventually I care that if the value coming from the server is 65, it will be 1 hour and 5 minutes. And this is the old way of doing it without the driver. So you see that I have a lot of mixture between um, data hooks and setting values, then scope digest, all the setup of compiling the template and everything. But eventually I'm testing all the things that I said that I'm going to test in the testing requirements. I'm checking that the value is getting split properly. I'm checking that if the item is empty, it does not have the duration, so both of them are 0. I'm testing that if I'm setting the values to 1 hour and 35 minutes, it will get converted into 95 minutes in the model itself. And I'm checking that the minimum values are 1 to begin with. And if the hours input is 2, then the minimum 4 minutes can be 0 and vice versa. Okay, so I'm testing all of it, but you see a lot of combination of DOM and getting into selectors and things like that. So it is nice, but as I said, it's a mix of selectors and expectations. So you don't really understand why did you set the value using the val method from jQuery. What were you trying to achieve? It's not really clear. And one reading the tests will not understand what am I doing as a setup for the test, what am I doing in order to explain the when part, and only the expectation. People might not really understand why do you expect that the val of that input will be that number. So it's not very clear. And most importantly, it's not really reusable. When I'm testing the main component of the page that I presented at the beginning, I may want to check that the whole page is eventually valid. And in order to do it, I have to populate all the required fields. So I have to get in touch with the inputs that are created by the duration picker, and I will have to repeat these selectors and set the values accordingly, which is something that we don't really want to do. We want to maintain it in just one place. So introducing Wix-based view unit driver. That's my daughter. Component-oriented testing kit. It removes the hassle of having to compile the template and things like that. It will be done in a separate place. It supports hierarchies. So if I have a parent component that has a child component that uses another component, when rendering the main one, the child component's drivers will get rendered as well, and I will be able to use it easily. And it has easy to use selectors, some methods in order to append everything to the body and remove it from the body, because if you want to test things like height of element, when you're doing it with a headless browser that does not attach the element to the DOM, it will have a height of 0. So if you want to test things like that, you have to attach it to the body of the DOM. The API includes several methods and members that you can see in the full documentation, but the ones that we are going to discuss one now are render from template, which removes all the need to, compile the element, then compile it with the scope, and then running root.digest. Selectors by data hook. It used to add a longer name, so if you're already using it, you will get a deprecation warning. So you have find by data hook and find all by data hook, which is quite similar to what we're using in Protractor, using dollar data and dollar data. The methods to connect to body, it can be considered as a good thing to disconnect from the body at the end, at the after each of your tests. Even if you did not connect it to the body, it will not harm to call this method. And define child, allowing a parent driver to define the child driver in order to be able to reuse its implementation. So let's see how we convert the driver that we just created, the view unit that we just created. Is everything clear by now? Do you have any questions? Great. So it's either great or you didn't understand anything. Okay. So the first thing I want to do is to create the driver. So, what's that? אתה צוחק או ברצינות? נראה לי שזה המקסימום. לא, הנה. זהו. Class my duration picker driver extends weeks base view unit driver. The first method that I want to create is a render method that will know to render it. I already see in the test that I'm using some items, so I probably want to accept it. And the usage is quite simple. Render from template, which is getting the template that I'm going to use, and an object that defines what do I want to add to the scope. So if I'm getting as an input the item, then I probably want to be able to use it over the scope here. So I need to pass it here. Okay. I will also want a way to access the two input element that I defined. I can copy and paste it from another place. It's ES6, so you don't have to. So I have two elements which are selected by the data hooks that I put in the view itself. And I can use them in order to define getter and setter for the hours and minutes elements. Sorry. These are. So as you can see, I'm using the hour element in order to access, in order to get the value from the input field using getter. And I'm having a setter in order to set a new value and run scope digest in order to have it applied. When you're using view unit, you will realize that you have to run some, for example, change method in order to trigger the events that are triggered when changing a value. It will not get triggered automatically, but with time you will learn how to use it and you will find it quite simple. Okay, so after I have these methods in the driver itself, which allows me to access the view that I created, I can now easily use it in the tests themselves. So now instead of defining scope.item, I can just use item. And if instead of all of this, I can use, let me define the driver itself. Let driver my duration picker. I need to initialize it at the beginning of the test. And I can now start using it. Try render with the item that I defined. And instead of all this thing, I can just do driver dot hours and okay. And the test is much clearer now. I'm sorry. Because I defined that my model is something that includes an attribute of which is duration. I don't want to work with the duration. I want eventually to render a class, and the class is extending a duration item because it has a member which is called duration of type int. Okay, so I want to simulate that here I'm working with a service or something like that rather than working with the next one is with empty input, which is something that we already defined. So I can just take this thing, put it over here, and when not providing an item, it will be just an empty object, and I'm expecting the values to be 0 and 0. Similarly, I can take the other two tests and replace them with something much quicker. I defined it, I gave it a different name. Never mind. Tuck, 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 tuck. Let me just get the methods. Minimum hours and minimum minutes. Okay, so you can see that the tests are much shorter now. I'm no longer using the scope or compile service or the element or anything like that. I'm just stating if I'm using a service, a class, whatever model that has a duration of 20, and after rendering it, if I change the hours and the minutes to 1 and 35, I'm expecting the duration will be 95. I'm expecting that the minimum will have a proper value. So now just by reading this, I don't have to bother myself with the way the DOM is created, the view itself, the selectors that I'm using. I just know that if I want to test one thing and I'm setting values, it is working properly. Is it clear? Did you understand the methods that I was using? Great. Also, if I'm looking into the view unit of the main component, which is using the duration picker, צריך להגדיל שוב, נכון? If I'm looking into the driver of the class form, I can see that it has a member called duration picker driver, which is the driver that we just defined. I also have a location picker driver that I created already, image picker driver, and time to driver. When I'm defining the children, I'm passing the driver as an instance of the driver. And if it has more than one and I want to be able to select a specific element in the DOM, because you know that you saw that we have time form and time two, I can also pass it a selector. So I will associate my driver to a specific instance of that component rather than just the first one or anything like that. And after I did it in the constructor, I defined my children. When I will render the class form driver, it will, in its view, there is an instantiation of the components that we saw. So I don't have to render them from the driver or anything like that, because when I'm rendering the parent component from its template is already including all the other components, so they are getting rendered automatically. It doesn't have to call the render method, because render from template is like when you do your testing, you're giving it the template, the main template to render. But if you have directives that you use there or services or anything like that, they will get rendered by the compilation of the component itself, not having to do nothing with the render method that we created in the driver. So you only have to render the main element, but the children will get initialized, meaning that the element that they are using will get associated automatically. The model will get reflected. So all the selectors that you define in the driver will keep working. And then when I want to set a value or anything like that, it's really simple. It's just, that's the template. Yeah, its view is already including the reference to the other component, so they are getting rendered by that. I wanted to test things that relate to height. The thing is that the date picker is a bootstrap element. So in order to have it working correctly, it has to be associated, it hooks itself to the body. So if I'm not connecting to the body, it doesn't work. Yeah. So there are scenarios that I find myself having to connect to the body, and that's done. And then I can see that during the test, the spec itself, you can see that I'm referring to the driver dot duration picker driver um, in order to, for example, set values. So if I want to test that the form that is wrapping everything is valid, I have to populate these values as well. So I can do it easily just by using the setter that I already defined in the driver. So I can reuse all the drivers that I created. Questions? Uh, you, in your test itself, you can define a listener, a spy on whatever, but eventually you don't want to call a method and then see that something is called. You want to see that your interface with the user is eventually the UI. So if, for example, you want to check navigation, you may want to spy on. Yeah, so in your specific test, the test itself will want to test that eventually you are trying, I don't know, to save the data to the server. So in that test, you will spy on the service that is saving the information in the server, and when you click a button or do whatever, you will expect it to get triggered with the values that you populated via the UI. But you probably want to test as much as possible in the UI itself, and only save activities, things that are doing navigation and you want to check the route, things like that, you will want to do using spies. Yeah. Mhm. Right. Yes. Whatever you want to load to the scope, you can pass it as the second parameter and it will work. The third parameter for render from template is also a selector, because sometimes your component, if you're testing something that usually resides within a form, like the duration picker is within a form. So maybe the template that you want to render is not just the component that you are testing, but maybe something that also wraps it has to be wrapped within a form or within a CSS class, so it will be rendered properly or anything like that. So in such a case, maybe you will, to the render from template method, you will also pass a selector, so it will select your component within a wider template. But it's quite rare. We added this support, but usually you will just let it use the entire element as the root of the component. Okay, so just like I used the selector in the date picker because I had more than one, it is also possible that within the template that I'm rendering, I have more than one instance of my component. And in such a case, maybe I will want to pass it a selector as well. Any other questions? Okay. So known limitations. Usually when you are um, defining things that relies on CSS definitions, you can load your main.css file into the Carmel file, and then the CSS definitions will be loaded. But provided that you're only testing a small portion of the page within the component testing, it is possible that the CSS definitions will not get hooked because it relies on some parent selector or anything like that. So you have to take that into consideration. try not to test CSS definitions. For example, if you want to check the visibility that you are changing using ng-show and ng-hide, check that the element has a class ng-show and ng-hide. Don't try to expect that it will not get displayed. ng-if, on the other hand, is actually removing the chunk from the DOM itself, so you can still see that it does not exist. Um, oh, yeah, the question was, what about cross-browser testing, which is not covered in View Unit? So there is more than one headless apart from Phantom. There is also one for Firefox, so we can start using them. But the bottom line is that, and this is related to the last point, we are not aiming to remove Protractor completely. We are aiming to test everything in the logic itself using View Unit and component testing, but then the main flow itself of navigating between the pages and things like that still needs to be tested using Protractor, so you are getting the coverage of that portion using Protractor. But nowadays, the problem is that every small thing that you want to check in your page is using all the Protractor heavy navigation and the integration with the web driver that are not really working. So at least 3 out of 4 tests that you are currently defining in Protractor can be tested in View Unit, and leaving only 25% of the tests in Protractor, so you are also covering the look and feel itself. So the sec we have unit test and end-to-end, but not component testing. And not referring to Angular component, but component testing. Um, Overlapping elements are clickable. When you're testing in Protractor, if you created wrong CSS definitions and one element is coming on top of the other and you try to click it, it will tell you that the element is not clickable and you will go ahead and fix it. Here, all the elements are one after the other, so you will not have this thing, so you will not find out that you made this problem. And page navigation, you can check the route itself, but it's not really running a flow. So the bottom line is that we are not saying, like Shachar said, we are not saying that we are going to remove Protractor completely. You will probably still want to cover each and every page using Protractor, but you will only do the main success flow instead of testing all the input validations and valid values and what happened if this is the input and what happened if that is the input. All of that can be covered in component testing. Yes. Um, we put it within the unit test file. The thing is that we already have a folder for components because you are creating components. So by definition, when you're testing an Angular component, you're probably doing it with component view unit testing. So there is no need to split it into another folder. Sure. Thank you. I gave it some, I will repeat the question. Since the drivers are relying on data hook and Protractor is relying on data hook, we are creating the same selectors into places, which is right. I gave, yeah, I gave it some thought, but I couldn't find a good way of achieving it. The thing is that the interface with the WebDriver is completely different from the interface with ViewUnit. So maybe we should create another level of abstraction that is implementing ViewUnit in order to implement the selectors and things like that in ViewUnit and clicking a button and whatever, and have a similar implementation, and then in runtime hook the right implementation to the driver. I gave it some thought, but currently we didn't find a good solution. But that can be a huge leap forward if we are able to do it. Yeah, yes, exactly. So basically to create a driver, and then the method of getting the input element will be implemented one way for the view unit and another way, but you're using the same driver, and then in runtime it will just use the right class. But again, I didn't find a good solution for it yet. But if someone is can think about a good way of achieving it, that would be great. Yeah. Right. Yeah, we did encounter such situations. Usually when I'm testing the whole page, maybe I have to load Bootstrap as well and things like that. But even when I tested the date picker, since it's using Bootstrap, I had to load Bootstrap into the view unit just for these tests and the tests of the parent that is using it. Um, it's a bit of a hassle, but it's working perfectly if you just add the module, so no problem there. The question, by the way, if you could not hear, is whether I found myself having to load into the test not just the internal module of the application, but also some external module, because automatically we're only loading the internal module. Anything else? That's the last slide. No. Okay. Um, please use it as soon as possible, because the next thing that we will want to do is to change the Yeoman generators to generate uh, the drivers instead of generating the way they are now and having to convert it manually. So I don't want to do it just yet, because you will generate things. You need to like do a small setup in your project in order to be able to use the driver. If you go to the documentation that is included in the presentation, there is an explanation as of how to do it. As soon as you are, we can convert the human generators. Maybe at the beginning, we'll convert it with some flag so you can convert it the other way. That's it. Thank you.